to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli. It is now, it's 9:10 p.m. here in a quite dreary Budapest, where I have to say the weather's getting a little bit better and the days are definitely getting longer. So this is the moment when I start the countdown to June the 21st, and when everything then heads in the wrong direction. But at the moment, I can at least say, well, things aren't that bad in terms of the weather and the amount of daylight that we can enjoy. So so a relatively positive um, notification. However, in the United States, it's now on the east coast of the United States. It's now 3:11 p.m. So thank you everybody who has joined me. S.A. Dillendam says awesome and mild weather in California. Yeah, that's the best thing about the California. That weather is quite extraordinary. I've said before, I spent some time out in California, and I didn't like it all that much. But the one thing I did like is the weather. I mean, like, you can see why people would really, once they get to California, they don't want to move back. I mean, of course, I wasn't like that. I mean, as soon as I was there, I was thinking of returning to the East Coast, but I can see why people wouldn't. So this is so mild and so pleasant. Why not stay? So there's several things to talk about. One thing that is really quite interesting is the this lawfare against President Trump that has continued really unremittingly. He's now president, and he's still fighting the courts. So the most recent fight that he's been engaged in was involved. Also, Keith McGlashing says, "Hello from Ontario, Canada. I love the Gaggle." Well, thank you very much. Welcome. Always like people from Ontario, Canada, and you have a big election coming up. I guess we can talk a little bit about that. There isn't that much interest worldwide in elections in Canada, but this one may be a little more interesting than most. So, well, there's a number of these in particular immigration litigation that Trump is embroiled in, and the most bizarre one was what happened over Easter weekend, when the U.S. Supreme Court made this very strange intervention. I mean, the litigation itself is very complicated, and I can't go through all the the ins and outs. But what had happened, Dan Rock, always good to see you. Welcome. Thank you very much for your generosity. But what had happened was that there was the ACLU had filed an emergency TRO in the Texas District Court, claiming that. So Essie Dellendam says Amy Goodman reported that Trump officials admitted an administrative error on Garcia. Yes, I think one DOJ official did admit that, but that DOJ official was then put on leave. I don't think I think it's a she was fired, but she was removed from the case. And the current state of play is that they don't really think that it was an administrative error. So, but anyway, that's a separate issue. I mean, there are these three at the moment, just three separate issues to keep, three separate cases to keep in mind. There's the case of Garcia, the one who is now in El Salvador. He's a citizen of El Salvador, but he's now in El Salvador, and who met Chris Van Hollen last week, and in fact over the weekend. And so that's one case. Then there's the case of the Judge Boasberg, the that very very politically operator in the D.C. District Court. He's the one who tried to call back the planes that were carrying these Venezuelans to El Salvador, and that was the use of the Alien Enemies Act by the Trump administration. So that's another case, and then there's this other separate case that took place um, in Texas. So the ACLU filed a TRO with the district court in Texas. Really, was towards the end of last week. So as we were heading into the Easter weekend, um, claiming that these Venezuelans, members of this Venezuelan gang, were about to be deported and sent to El Salvador under the Aliens Enemies Act. And but the problem was that the government said, well, we don't have any plans to deport anyone. But nonetheless, the ACLU persisted um, with the district court, even telephoning the district court, claiming that, well, there's this they're about to be deported under the Alien Enemies Act, and giving very limited time for um, the court to respond. And then, in any case, then the ACLU took the matter to the Fifth Circuit, claiming that there's a real emergency because the, um, the government was about to deport these Venezuelans. Now, the the Fifth Circuit kind of took this case, but they really didn't have anything to do because essentially, if you're, the way it works is that you have to have a decision from a lower court before a higher court can make a ruling. I mean, they can turn it around, or at least there has to be some evidence presented that the lower court was just dragging its feet and not acting. But there was no evidence that the lower court was dragging its feet, or that the lower court had issued any kind of a ruling. So basically, the Fifth Circuit kind of took it upon itself. Said, okay, well, we'll you know, essentially, we deny the petition on the part of the ACLU because really there's nothing for us to overturn or to rule on because the district court hadn't actually made any kind of a decision. And then the ACLU took the matter to the U.S. Supreme Court, and then the U.S. Supreme Court issued its bizarre kind of 1 o'clock in the morning ruling, essentially prohibiting the Trump administration from using the Aliens Enemies Act to deport anyone, and until further notice. And so this was really a very very strange ruling because it came pretty much at the same time, at the same moment at which the Fifth Circuit had said, well, there's nothing for us to do. We don't have any jurisdiction in this case because the district court, the lower court, hadn't really made any kind of a decision, and basically it was moving at a nice clip to address the concerns of the ACLU. But the same thing should have applied to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court didn't have jurisdiction until there was a ruling on the part of the Fifth Circuit. But the Fifth Circuit ruled essentially saying, we don't have anything to do, we don't have jurisdiction. That it came out at about exactly the same time as the U.S. Supreme Court essentially you know, issued its decision prohibiting the government from using the Alien Enemies Act. And this was a very, very strange decision. Seven of the Supreme Court justices um, went along with this. Two, of course, didn't. This was the Alito and Thomas, and then Alito, I guess, a few hours later, wrote his opinion, in which he was very scornful of his Andrew Ackley says, deport the Gagglers. It's very difficult to say where would we be deported to. That'd be very, very strange. But okay, it's getting into the spirit of it. But one really has to read Alito's decision in its very, very scornful towards his idiot colleagues. I mean, what the hell are you doing? You don't have jurisdiction. You can't have jurisdiction. The Supreme Court cannot just step in. First of all, the issue of the Alien Enemies Act. I mean, the Supreme Court had already ruled in the Boasberg case that really falls within the jurisdiction of the president. That is a matter that the president alone can make that decision. I mean, they said yes, defendants or anyone about to be deported has a right of habeas. But the decision on whether you use the Alien Enemies Act, that falls within the president. It's up to the president to make that call. So they kind of turned around, went against their own decision from just a couple of weeks ago on the use of the Alien Enemies Act. Because then back then they just said, well, the president can make a decision. President can make absolute decision to remove anyone under the Alien Enemies Act, even though any deportee does have the right to make a habeas petition, because there might be injustice involved. But and then they made the point that, well, since it is a habeas petition, then it has to take place in the jurisdiction in which the deportees are to be found, and that's why it said basically Boasberg in D.C. had no jurisdiction over the case. It's because essentially Boasberg is in D.C. The deportees were in Texas. And so, therefore, that's where a habeas petition needs to be filed, and that was the rule. But now they just simply said, no, you can't use the Alien Enemies Act to deport until further notice. So they went against their own decision from 2 weeks earlier. So that's a really peculiar decision. S.A. Dillenham says Alito is usually the favorite of the libertarians. Well, Alito was talking very, very sensibly. I mean, it was a very sensible using common sense. I mean, common sense, first of all, saying, the Supreme Court can't really intervene until there is a factual or legal basis that has been laid down. And usually, when the lower courts have all weighed in, both sides at the lower courts and at the appellate courts had a chance to present their case. But in this, what was so strange about this, and Alito made that point, was that the government hadn't even presented any kind of an argument. I mean, that was, it's slightly a kind of an ex parte decision, because the only people who have been able to present their arguments before the court had been the ACLU, acting on behalf of the Venezuelans. So the government didn't even present any arguments. They didn't have a chance to present an argument. The whole thing was rushed. So the government didn't have a chance to present an argument, but there wasn't even any set of decisions that the Supreme Court could review. I mean, that's the whole point. I mean, when you have that hierarchical system of courts, the higher courts can weigh in on the decisions made by the lower courts, and then they can review those decisions and see whether there were errors made on matters of fact or law. But in this case, there just there was no record. None of the courts had actually made any kind of a decision before the Supreme Court weighed in. And the Supreme Court didn't explain why it had decided to weigh in, and why it didn't even seek out, before weighing in, the arguments from the government, the defendants, in other words. It was really bizarre. I mean, it came out, about 1 o'clock in the morning on Saturday. So it's Saturday, so it's after Good Friday. Never a good idea to do anything at 1 in the morning. I mean, it's like just, you're probably not at your sharpest at 1 in the morning. So that's now this peculiarity, and you get a situation where, because up until now, the Roberts Court has always been very, very punctilious about not short circuiting anything. They don't get involved until the whole legal record has been made. You're starting off from the lower courts, and then your decisions, and then you move to the higher courts, and again, all the arguments and everything that So in other words, only right at the end of this process does the Supreme Court get involved. That has been the hallmark, particularly of the Roberts Court, that they're not going to short circuit anything. And we saw that in the Trump cases, when Trump wanted the U.S. Supreme Court to step in, and the U.S. Supreme Court just wouldn't do it. It's not, we're not stepping in. We got to you got to let the system work itself through. No, no one's jumping into anything. So here, they don't seem to have done that. And then they haven't explained why they've abandoned their principle of allowing the system to work its way through. Why they jumped in? No explanation at all. And why they've gone against the very principle that they had argued before, which is that immigration policy is really in the hands of the executive. So therefore, that it's up to the executive to decide who comes in or out of the country. So remember, when Biden allowed, and he allowed millions to come into the country, and various district courts did try to weigh in against the Biden administration. The Supreme Court slapped them down. They said, no. This immigration falls within the jurisdiction of the executive. The president gets to decide, who comes in and out of the country. And they slapped them down, slapped down the lower courts. They slapped down when Greg Abbott tried to, he said, well, there's an invasion into the country, and he tried to uh, put up fences around the border, the Texas Mexico border. He tried to put up fences. He said, "Well, I could do it. I mean, this isn't the federal government, the state government, but nonetheless, this is an invasion of Texas, and then immigration is obviously hurting Texas, so therefore I'm entitled to put up, a wire to prevent this mass migration." And the Supreme Court and the Biden administration said, right, well, we're going to take down the barriers that Abbott had put up. We're just going to take them down. This is beyond the remit of the state government. It's the federal government, and the federal government, sent in the National Guard to take down the barbed wire that Greg Abbott had built. And the Supreme Court weighed in and said, yeah, that's it. The Biden administration, it's entirely within their responsibility to do this. None other than, Greg Abbott had no right to start, putting up any kind of barriers to mass migration entry. So, there, the Supreme Court absolutely, unambiguously said, no, it falls within the jurisdiction of the federal government. So now, apparently, when when you're letting in hundreds, thousands, millions of migrants, that apparently, the federal government is entitled to do that. Whether you like it or not, the federal government is entitled to that. It's federal government responsibility. But when you try to do something about it, you're trying to remove the people who had come into the country illegally, then apparently it's up to the courts. It's no longer the matter of the federal government, so that it's a matter of the federal government when you're letting people in. But when you try to remove them, then it's no longer, the federal government does not have the right to remove them. Then it's time for the courts. Now, this is obviously total insanity, a kind of a complete insane logic that the Supreme Court is operating under. So absolutely, you can bring in millions of people. That's you may not like it, but that's the federal government responsibility. Try to remove them, and then it's a matter of the courts. Oh well, there has to be due process. They're entitled to due process. But of course, the thing about due process is that nobody knows exactly what that means, because obviously, a citizen of the United States has due process rights. I mean, there it is. It's in the, you got the Fifth Amendment, you got the Sixth Amendment, you've got the 14th Amendment. All that guarantees your due process rights. And people who are legally in the United States also have some due process rights. Not the same as the citizens. I don't think it's exactly the same, but they have due process rights. But if you're in the country illegally, if you've broken into the country, it's hard to see that you have the same due process rights as American citizens do. I don't think if you've broken into the country, you can start invoking your Fifth, Sixth, and 14th Amendment rights, because you're not even supposed to be there. So I mean, you obviously have some due process rights. I mean, I think you do obviously. The habeas petition, I mean, is a reasonable one, because it's entitled. Everybody's entitled, at the very least, to show that that to be removed is actually being done properly by the government, that they're not just removing somebody who's actually legally entitled to be in the country. I mean, it's just so you have to at least be able to show that you're not legally entitled to be in the country, and therefore you are deportable. But that doesn't really mean that you can just endlessly jerk the system around, and that's really what the goal, what the goal of the lawyers, the goal of the courts is to show that essentially deportation is a non-starter. Because if you think about what's going on now, um, with the Trump administration, remember Trump had said during the campaign that he would be deporting millions of migrants. Although he's going to deport at the very least everyone who had entered the country illegally during the Biden years. And of course, then he was said, "Well, what are you going to do? Are you going to go inside people's towns and villages, into people's homes, haul them out, put them in a paddy wagon, and then ship them to the border? Are you really going to do that?" And then the Trump people said, "Well, all right, we're not thinking about that right now. We're just going to go after the criminals. The ones who we've got there's evidence that that they have criminal past or they have criminal connections. They're members of criminal gangs. We'll go after them. Then we'll discuss everybody else. But we'll start off with the criminals." That's what they've done, and that's the fights that are taking place right now in the courts deal just with that. In other words, the very people that should be the easiest to remove would be the ones who, but at the very least, there is a prima facie case that they're criminal past, they had criminal connections. In other words, these are people who are deportable. In other words, they have no legal right to be here. I mean, legal right to be in the United States, and they have criminal connections. That's it. That's all that the Trump administration is now trying to do, and that's the one, and it's not really succeeding, because the courts have suddenly said, well, even though these people are in the country illegally, they broke into the country, and even though there's clearly prima facie evidence in many of these cases that they have some criminal connection, you can't deport them because you have to go through this whole legal process. Now, the case of Garcia is somebody mentioned that it's kind of instructive here, because he's now the sort of the martyr, the Maryland man. So I remember he entered the country in 2011, and then lived there till 2019, and then he came to the attention of the police. He was arrested. He was suspicious, and the police, the Montgomery County police, suspected that he was a member of MS-13. I mean, there are a variety of ways that they made suspect, who the people were that he was hanging out with when they arrested him, his tattoos, that they, and they had an informer who said that he's a member of MS-13. But given that he was clearly in the country illegally, then really it should be pretty straightforward. Basically, deportation. Nothing more to be said here. And then the court said, that's right. Yeah, he should be deported. However, he can't go to El Salvador because he might be in danger from some gang, not the MS-13, some rival gang. He might be in danger. So he can be deported, but he has to be taken to some other country than El Salvador. Well, that's it. Because, of course, once you make that determination, deport him, but you can't take him to El Salvador, even though he's a citizen of El Salvador. then well, what country is going to take him? Well, of course, no country is going to take him. I mean, why would any country take him? I mean, well, how does he benefit any other country? Why would Honduras take him, or Guatemala take him? Or, I mean, why would Costa Rica take him? Why would anyone take him? Panama. I mean, none of them would take him. I mean, but how? They say, well, why? What do we need him for? He's likely to be a net liability for us. He's going to cost us money. Not to mention, with his somewhat sordid past, he's likely to add to our criminal problem. So no one's going to take him, and of course, no one did take him. And that was the clever move on the part of the immigration judge to say, yeah, all right, well, he should be deported, but he can't be taken to El Salvador. So that was in 2019, and nothing much happened till 2025, when he was finally deported under the Alien Enemies Act. Now, that was that decision on the part of the administration, and they took him to El Salvador. And so the whole thing about how there's some great injustice has been done, that the rule of law had been violated or whatever, it was all essentially done. Well, the only flaw that you can point to is that a lowly immigration judge. I remember, these are very lowly judges. These are not district court judges, they're not circuit court judges. This is a lowly immigration judge, about as low as you can be in the totem pole. That said, he shouldn't be taken to El Salvador because he might be in danger from a rival gang. Now, the problem there is that, well, does that mean that lowly immigration judges just determine immigration policy? That any immigration judge can make some determination, therefore the government can't do anything about it other than go through the process, which it had already done. It just so happened that the Biden administration just really didn't do anything. I mean, they could have easily appealed that decision by the immigration judge in 2019, or at least made some effort to remove him, but they didn't. And that's why he's, year after year, has gone on living in the United States. So okay, what if that's the case? Then essentially, again, no one is ever deported, because anyone could always say, well, I can't go to my home country because I'm really in serious danger, and that was really the case. I mean, that's why it's almost impossible ever to remove anyone. I mean, that's true very much in Europe, but it's also true in the United States, because you've got all the smart lawyers who are going to say, well, he's entitled to stay here temporarily, of course. And that's why when we have all the talk now on CNN, MSNBC, oh, well, we got to, Garcia needs to be brought back to the United States because of this decision by an immigration judge. He needs to be brought back. But of course, once he's brought back, he will be deported. Yeah, absolutely. He'll be deported. But he has to be brought back first. But you bring him back first, and then he'll be deported. No, he'll be deported. No problem about deportation. No one's questioning the deportation. We'll just bring him back. But of course, that's the point. Once you bring him back, then there's no way he's going to be deported, because you're going to have the same problem as before. He's a citizen of El Salvador who can't be removed to El Salvador. So therefore, you're going to have to find a third country to take him. No third country is going to take him, so he has to stay in the United States. And that's the point. That's the way this Trump policy of deportations is being sabotaged by the courts. Because essentially, and as I said, these are the easy cases. These are the criminal cases. So Garcia, they already had, at the very prima facie evidence about his MS-13 connection. The case with Boasberg, again, there was considerable evidence that they had gang connections. And then the same with these Venezuelans in Texas, about this, in which the Supreme Court weighed in. So you now have again, all of them are in the country illegally. All of them, there's at least some evidence that they have gang connections. Now this is again where the whole due process things. Well, we haven't really proven that they have gang connections. Well, if that's going to be the case, if that's what you're looking for, is then it's going to be there forever. That you're going to be tied up in the courts forever trying to prove that somebody or other has gang connections. But it's not incumbent upon the government. Government doesn't have to go and prove anything. And because ultimately, I mean, if you're in the country illegally, then you're in the country illegally. It doesn't have to go to any huge effort, time, and money to start proving that you have gangland connections. But that's why the whole thing is being tied up in the courts. And if Trump can, if the way the Supreme Court is going to go, and if all the courts are going to go saying, well, you can't even remove the people who have clear criminal pasts, criminal connections, and who are here illegally. If you can't even do that, then what hope do you have of removing anyone from the country? And that's really the goal. Because if Trump cannot do this, if Trump fails to with his policy of mass deportation, then essentially the next argument is going to be, or the next claim will be, well, you've got to offer amnesty. You've got to offer, pathways to citizenship. And then, of course, once you do that, then there's been the massive stampede to the border, because then everybody was going to want to storm into the United States in the expectation that 10, 15, 20 years from now, there will be another mass amnesty. And that was really that disastrous policy of Reagan in 1986, when he offered an amnesty. Now, the way they worked it was that, well, it'll be an amnesty in exchange for tightening immigration restrictions. That's all. It's always that. They're always promising that. I mean, in the Reagan case, there was a commitment that employers would be punished for if they hired illegals, but that never materialized. So you got the amnesty, you didn't get the restrictions at the border, and you never got the punishment for employers. And of course, once you had that amnesty, it encouraged everyone else to say, well, yeah, I come into the country legally, and sometime down the road there will be an amnesty. And there have been a number of attempts at these amnesties. I mean, there was George W. Bush. He tried it a couple of times. He tried it in 2001 and in 2007. And then Obama also tried it in 2013. And that's clearly, that's what acts as the incentive to continue to pour into the United States, the expectation that there will be an amnesty. And if Trump fails to get even the criminals out, then you say, well, you basically, that's it. You're never going to get anyone out. Um, and of course that sends a message in Europe as well, where you can't, it's hopeless. You can't take anyone out because the courts are going to step in, and the courts are just going to forever jerk you around. I mean, there's a lot of money splashing around these law firms, powerful law firms. There are all these NGOs, as with like the ACLU. They're always hovering, and they're just going to tie you up in the courts. So the Supreme Court made that the step of stepping into this case when there was absolutely no reason for it to do so. The easiest thing for the Supreme Court would have been, hey, let the system work itself out. We're not going to get involved until it's worked its way through the system. No need for us to jump in. As I say, that's what the Supreme Court usually does. It certainly did that in the Trump cases. Where really outrageous things were being done to Trump, including the the case in New York, the one brought by Big Tish James, who is herself now likely to be prosecuted for fraud. Uh, but in that case, which was an obvious outrage, and it was a joke. I mean, even and clearly it was just an absurdity of bringing a fraud case against Trump when they couldn't find anybody to claim that they've been defrauded um, by Trump. Very different, incidentally, from the Big Tish James's case, because Big Tish had defrauded the taxpayers, because if the allegation against her are true, um, in which basically she had claimed that this house that she had bought in Virginia was her main home, even though she lived spent 5 nights a week in New York as the New York Attorney General. So because she made that claim for the purpose of getting a reduced mortgage, then essentially she was indeed defrauding the taxpayers. And so that, unlike the Trump case, because there was no evidence that Trump had defrauded any taxpayers, but Big Tish uh, has defrauded, if the allegations are true, and it looks like they're true because there's documentary evidence that she claimed that this house in Virginia is going to be her primary home. Um, so but again, in all these cases, in that case and in that loony case, which also in New York, with Judge Merchan, and where again Trump committed some kind of a fraud. Trump, the victim of an extortion. I mean, this was an extortion perpetrated against him by a porn star in cahoots with a felon, a fraudster and felon, Michael Cohen, who they conceived this plan to extort money from Trump. So Trump was the victim, but somehow they convicted him of 34 felonies because of a bookkeeping thing. He claimed that this was a legal expense, which of course he was, rather than something else, and the court never really spelled out what was it that he should have called it, if not a legal expense. But anyway, that was so obvious, it's such an obvious travesty. And the fact was that they could only bring it in a jurisdiction such as New York, where you can absolutely guarantee, in Manhattan particularly, you can guarantee that every single person in the jury pool is going to hate Trump, and you can guarantee that you have the judges, prosecutors, everybody just hates Trump. So you can bring this case, get a conviction, 34 felony counts, an obvious uh, abuse of the legal process, Supreme Court didn't step in, didn't say, "Hey, you can't do that." There has to be at least some integrity in the in the judicial process. No, they never stepped in. They said, "Oh, we'll wait for the whole thing to percolate through the system." It's going to take years and years while it percolates through the system. So, but in this case, the Roberts Court jumped in. They felt they had to, even though there was absolutely no basis for jumping in. There was no record. There was no ruling by the district court. There was no ruling by the circuit court. There was no basis at all for the Supreme Court to jump in. So that's that. But you can now see that this immigration fight could well be the defining fight of the Trump administration, because if it's not getting anywhere on this, and this is the one that should be the easiest to do, then what can you do? So yes, that. Now the other thing that I guess is kind of interesting is the death of Pope Francis, and we talked about it a little bit with Peter yesterday, and I don't have that much more to add. I think it's quite interesting, though, that he that the media have obviously dwelled on Francis's evidently enlightened, progressive views on LGBTQ plus issues. They dwelled on his advocacy on behalf of the migrants, and particularly his quite harsh criticisms on the harsh criticisms of the Trump administration's treatment of migrants. So they were, of course, very gleeful about that, and then they were gleeful when Francis stepped in. There were the American bishops who didn't want to give Holy Communion to Biden because of his support for abortion rights, and he said, "No, you can't do that. No. He's entitled to this Holy Communion." And so that was, they were always very gleeful that, hey, look, Francis obviously doesn't seem to like doesn't like Trump, but he has a much, he kind of likes American liberals much more. Which I think, and there's some truth to that. I mean, I remember when he visited the United States, and of course he was showered. Everyone loved him with Obama and everyone else, and he gave a speech somewhere, and he talked about the familiar thing about the culture of death, and that's something the Catholic Church talks about. But when they talk about the culture of death, they are referring to the church, which of course is opposed to the death penalty, but the church is also opposed to abortion. Obviously, the Catholic Church are very opposed to abortion, and the church, of course, is opposed to euthanasia. So he starts talking about the culture of death, and there in the audience is Obama and Michelle and the usual characters, and then you kind of wonder, oh, well, that's interesting. So are you going to bring up the Catholic Church's opposition to abortion? I mean, It's an important part of the doctrine. Um, but he talked about the culture of death, and then he turned to Obama and said, I really thank you for your opposition to the death penalty. And Obama said, yep, okay, that's great. And then, so there it was. He avoided the whole topic of abortion, turns to Obama and says, yeah, really thank you for your opposition to the death penalty, which is an easy, there's an easy one. Yeah, thank you. I'm against the death penalty. Yeah. Um, but that's the point. That I mean, if you're going to do, if you're going to espouse the Catholic doctrine, and you are going to bring up the culture of death, which Pope John Paul II used to do, then it's a threesome. It's abortion, it's the death penalty, and it's assisted suicide. Now, America hasn't yet gone down the path of assisted suicide. I mean, other countries have in Europe, but America hasn't yet. I mean, some states have, but America hasn't embraced assisted suicide. Um, but he didn't go down that path. Instead, he brought up the death penalty, and that, of course, endeared him to all the liberals. What a fantastic guy, that's it. So, hey, but what happened to abortion? I mean, that's kind of, it's a big issue for you, and so so they really like that aspect of Francis, and of course they like when he says, like, who am I to judge, which was a kind of a stupid thing for him to say. And again, it was apropos of the issue of providing communions to blessing gay couples, and all of that. I mean, so he says, well, who am I to judge? Which is a very strange thing to say for the head of the church. I mean, the whole point is, if you're going to get to be the head of the church, then you have to provide some kind of moral guidance, moral, spiritual guidance. That's what people look to you for. I mean, yeah, somebody else, the man on the bus, say, well, who am I to judge? Oh, that's fine. Who are you to judge? We are all sinners, and so on. I'm not, I don't want to judge someone else. But everyone just loved it. Oh, that's fantastic. You said this great. Wow. That's it. Who am I to judge? Yeah, that's it. That's what Jesus said. Let he who's without sin cast the first stone, which actually doesn't quite say, who am I to judge? Jesus never said, who am I to judge? But they kind of managed to confound these two issues. But the Pope, as the head of the Roman Catholic Church, is supposed to judge. That's you're supposed to have a doctrine, a theology, a liturgy, and you have a whole council of cardinals who make these decisions about the doctrine. So when you say, well, who am I to judge? Well, you've got this huge, gigantic bureaucracy, senior cardinals, steeped in theology, who are there to provide guidance, moral guidance. That's what they're there for. You have to go beyond just simply saying, well, who am I to judge? Well, let he who's without sin cast the first stone. We can get that from anyone. We don't need a pope to say that. But of course, the people who admire Francis, the people who say, oh, what a fantastic guy, they are not themselves Catholics. By and large, they are not themselves Catholics. Like the New York Times editorial board, they are not Catholics. The people on Morning Joe, I've always loved him. Most of them are not Catholics. Or if they are, it's little more than a pro forma thing. It's just a cool thing to do, to say, yeah, I'm a Catholic, but you don't actually do anything that's actually Catholic. So they all that stuff they like about Francis. Interestingly enough, what didn't get much play in the case of Francis is some of the things that he has said, which are not quite within the liberal consensus. For example, he's been quite harsh um, in his comments about Israel and what Israel has been doing, and that's fairly consistent. Part of the Catholic Church. Pope John Paul II also spoke out quite harshly on Israel, but Francis has done that. So obviously, he's criticized Hamas, but he's definitely spoken out very, very severely and emotionally about what Israel has been doing in Gaza. Pummeling civilians, destroying ways of life in Gaza, and he's spoken out about that. That didn't get much play in the obituary. New York Times, boom, no mention at all of Gaza, no mention of Israel. Another thing that didn't get much play is that he wasn't buying into the prevailing consensus on the war in Ukraine. He was actually spoke out very firmly, saying this isn't a story of Little Red Riding Hood and the bad wolf. This is a much more complicated situation, a serious historic conflict that one can't simply moralize about in any facile way. He said that. And he said that he and that he had said that this was provoked. Now he didn't quite say that that's his belief, but the way he presented it, he said, "A very wise man came to me, the president of a country, and he explained to me that this was provoked, and that it was provoked by NATO moving to Russia's border." He said that, that this was provoked by NATO's move to Russia's border. This also didn't get much play in the obituaries. They preferred, oh yeah, fantastic, got LGBT, or what, yeah. But nonetheless, say that I'm no fan of supposed moral and spiritual leaders who adopt in a facile way fashionable uh, liberal bromides. You think, oh God, that's the best you can do? You'll spent your whole life in this church, worked your way up in the hierarchy, and the best you can do is to sound like any liberal in any town in Europe, any town in the United States. That's exactly the kind of things that they say. So you think, is that the best you can do? So I'm not a great fan. I mean, if you're going to be the head of a church, if you're going to espouse this the Catholic doctrine, then you got to go do a little bit better than that. And I mean, otherwise, why bother? Why bother with religion? Why bother with the Christianity? Why bother with the Catholic Church? I mean, the whole point is, if you're going to be in the Catholic Church, is you want your dogma, you want your traditional doctrine, you want your hierarchy, and you want your pope at the head of the church. And you don't want the complete free for all where everybody gets to opine on what they think is morally right or not. So if that's the best that you can do, I mean, what's the point of joining the Catholic Church? I would imagine that whoever comes after him will probably be very similar to him. I think, because he has a lot of the cardinals who are going to make the decision are his appointees. The number is quite stunning. I think something like, I don't know, maybe 75% of the cardinals who are going to make the decision on the next pope were Francis appointees. So if that's the case, then they're probably going to choose somebody that's similar to him. Anyway, let's take a look at the our locals page, where the people come and deliver some uh, uh, tribute to these hounds, the ferocious hounds, just to keep them at bay, because otherwise, they know that things are going to get very grim if, if they're in a bad mood, and they're often in a very bad mood when there's nothing in the tip jar. So really appreciate our locals community and the fact that they are so uh, they're so concerned about, particularly about my well-being. Let's see. So, all right. So, Shopronka. So, thank you. Shopronka says, "Do you think uh, Trump will have a Damascene moment and stop the genocide?" Um, that's a really interesting question. Um, my obviously my instinct says no. Um, I think the way Trump looks upon the Middle East is, he buys into all the familiar nostrums about Israel, the great ally, and so on and so forth. But I think that in his view, Israel pretty much has free reign to do whatever it wants when it comes to the West Bank, when it comes to Gaza. If he wants to get rid of all the Palestinians, um, it's more or less he's going to say, well, do it. Don't involve us. We're not going to do it for you. Don't but you go ahead and do it. Um, where he doesn't give Israel carte blanche is on anything outside of Palestine. So on the decisions that he's going to make on Iran, and I think the odds have to be at the moment that he will sign a deal with Iran. I mean, I hope he does. But he seems to be taking this very seriously, these negotiations with Iran, which means that he's going to ignore the Israel lobby, he's going to ignore Netanyahu and come to an agreement with Iran. But by the same token, he's going to have to give Israel something in exchange for doing nothing not in exchange for not taking Israel's lead on Iran. Um, so I think you can expect Trump to do something to defy Israel. I don't think he will do it on the matter of the Palestinians. I just I don't think he cares very much. I don't think I don't think there are very many American politicians who care very much about the Palestinians. I mean, I think it's been the case for a long time. I mean, various American politicians over the years have, um, to the extent that they cared about the Arabs against Israel, then they cared about Saudi Arabia, wanted to maintain stability in Saudi Arabia, stability in the Persian Gulf, or they wanted to maintain the Jordanian kingdom. They wanted to support Egypt. That's the extent of the American concern with Arab sensibilities. They've never really given a damn about the Palestinians. Jimmy Carter did a little bit of that. I think Jimmy Carter he did a little bit of that in Camp David, and then, of course, in subsequent years, he wrote a number of books about the Middle East, and particularly the issue of the Palestinians. But Jimmy Carter was really quite exceptional like that. So, I mean, to answer your question, I would doubt that Trump is going to do that. I mean, Trump has so many problems at the moment on his plate. I mean, he's aroused a lot of enmity because he's attacked a lot of institutions. And a lot of these institutions are very powerful, and they're going to fight back, and they're going to really embroil the administration in some very difficult lawsuits. I mean, like he's taking on the powerful universities. That's going to be quite a challenge to deal with Harvard and the rest. He's downsizing the federal bureaucracy. You're going to get a lot of resistance from within the federal bureaucracy, and they're going to go to the courts and try to prevent Trump from slashing the federal government. So that's going to be a problem. Um, and then of course he has the well, as I said, he has the immigration issue, but he also has the foreign policy issue, which is if he does go ahead with the Iran deal, there's going to be a lot of opposition on that. But then he's also got to deal with the Russia-Ukraine issue, and if if he does deal with it and just doesn't let it drift, but if he does bite the bullet and try to bring this war to an end, he is going to absolutely enrage the whole national security, media, think tank world, because they are going to go out in force in defense of Ukraine. But you can't bring this war to an end unless you basically cut Ukraine off. That's the only way you can do it. Otherwise, you're just going to pursue Biden's policy. So if Trump does pursue this, does bring this war to an end, then he's going to have to just cut Ukraine adrift and say that's it. We're washing our hands off it in some form or other. Trump will have to say that. So that's going to generate a lot of opposition. So he's got a lot of problems ahead of him, and so I just don't think he wants to, an additional one with the Israel lobby. So unfortunately, I think that he's going to continue with his indifference towards the Palestinians. Anyway, Shopronka, thank you. Dan Rock, always good to see you. And then Vic Shakapopoulos. And it says, Dear George, once again I will shout it out. Who killed the Kennedys? While knowing that after all it was you and me, to one of your points that JFK killing didn't really change the course of history, so there was no incentive to kill him. I thought about it myself before, and I think one can make the case that he was the last president who would have a rather public feud with the intelligence services. And then Vic goes on, I guess the other two after him who had some conflicts with the spooks would be Nixon and Trump, and we know how they were pressured themselves. But for 60 years since the assassination, we basically accepted the notion that you don't want to mess with the CIA if you want to be a president. And then the intelligence community themselves even groomed some people to become president, namely George H.W. Bush and his son, possibly Obama, whose mother was in the USA. Couldn't we consider what happened in Dallas to be the beginning of a coup d'etat? Well, that's an interesting argument. The one thing that you have to keep in mind when you make the case that Kennedy was taking on the CIA, and I mentioned this I think a couple of weeks ago, is that it's always the evidence, the primary source of evidence for this, the assertion that Kennedy wanted to take on the CIA, was this comment that Kennedy supposedly said in the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs. So we're talking about quite a long time before the assassination, because Bay of Pigs, that's April 1961. But in the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs debacle, Kennedy supposedly said that I want to break up the CIA into 1,000 little pieces and let the wind scatter them. Now, there's one problem with that story, is that there's no record of Kennedy ever having said that. This quote appeared in a story in the New York Times, published I think in 1966, but the source that the New York Times quoted was anonymous. So that's the only source there is that Kennedy said, I want to break up the CIA into 1,000 little pieces and let the wind scatter them. But even if it were true, and Kennedy did say that, then he would have said that after the Bay of Pigs. And you can see why he would have been very angry and frustrated about the outcome of the Bay of Pigs invasion, because it had been a huge embarrassment for the United States. And again, let's remember that Kennedy could have stopped the Bay of Pigs invasion. He didn't do it. So there's no real basis for saying that somehow he went against anything the CIA did, because he allowed the invasion to go forward. Now, he didn't provide air cover for the invasion, because if he had provided air cover, then the official story would have been rendered ridiculous. I mean, the official story is that the United States had nothing to do with the invasion. I mean, they said, oh, this is just simply a bunch of disgruntled Cuban exiles who were very unhappy about the communist regime in Havana and took it upon themselves to invade Cuba and take Cuba away from the communists. That was planned to be the official line. So if Kennedy had provided air cover to the Cubans, then you would say, well, this is obviously an American-led invasion. And that would have been very difficult for the United States to justify. So it's understandable that Kennedy said, no, I'm not going to do it. But he did allow the invasion to go forward. And I don't think Eisenhower, given the planning for the invasion had begun during the Eisenhower years. Kennedy inherited it, but Kennedy signed off on it. But I don't think Eisenhower would have signed off on the use of American air power, because if you sign off on American air power, then it seems like America basically is invading Cuba, and that's awfully hard to justify, or at least on that basis. I mean, since there was no evidence at that stage that Cuba had done anything against the United States. Just you can't just invade because you don't like the communists. Now, then what happened after the Bay of Pigs, however, was that the CIA, at the behest of the Kennedys, launched this Operation Mongoose against Castro, and basically to topple the Castro regime. And then they came up with all these ridiculous, dirty tricks, having his beard fall out, they were poisoning him, and everything else. So that was authorized by Kennedy. That there was either assassinating Castro or overthrowing him using all kinds of very shady characters that still had links with Cuba, because the mafia had a whale of a time back in the Batista years. So there was still all the remnants of the mafia infrastructure that still existed in Cuba, and the CIA made use of that. But Kennedy had signed off on it. Kennedy worked with the CIA in Vietnam, so I don't quite see really that there was any grievance that the CIA had with Kennedy. Now, obviously, they didn't like the fact that Kennedy fired Alan Dulles after the Bay of Pigs debacle. But however, that didn't damage the CIA in any way. I mean, basically, it was an almighty cock up. If there's an almighty cock up, somebody is made to walk the plank. So Alan Dulles, he was the head of the CIA. He was made to walk the plank, and Kennedy fired him. But I don't think that the CIA would go and assassinate Kennedy because they were unhappy about Alan Dulles losing his job. I don't see the motivation. So I mean, it goes back to my problem is that I still don't see why the CIA would want to kill Kennedy. The only thing is, the only grievance you can say that they had was the Bay of Pigs. But after all, as I said, he supported it. He signed off on it. He could easily have said, "I'm not going to do it. I'm stopping this invasion." I mean, if he had done that and then he had been assassinated, then at least there might be a story that you could say, "Hey, the CIA was getting ready to invade Cuba, and then Kennedy stopped this." But since the invasion took place, and of course it was half baked and was easily defeated, you can't really blame Kennedy for that. I mean, it was the CIA that made a hash of this. So I don't really see it, but I'm sure next week, Vic, you're gonna ask me again about the assassination. Um, and then Vic says, "Don't." Okay. And then Vic says, "Have you ever read The Society of the Spectacle by Guy Debord, 1967, and his essay from 1980, Comments on the Society of the Spectacle, where he revisits the work?" I haven't read that. I mean, I know the book, and but I haven't read it. Okay, let's see. I'm gonna look at that. Maybe we can do that as a if I think it's, I'll take a look and see whether it's worth doing as a Gaggle book club. The Society of the Spectacle, Guy Debord. Okay, I'm going to take a look at it today and see if maybe we can have it um, as a book club. Robert, always very good to see you. Thank you very much for your generosity as always, Robert. Robert says, speaking of California, nearly half its land is actually under federal control. Yeah, Trump has called for HUD and the Interior Department to free up hundreds of thousands of federally controlled acres suitable for new housing developments. This would be a major end run around NIMBYism and the inappropriate use of zoning ordinances to block new housing. Huge problem in California. It could go a long way toward making housing affordable again. That's a really interesting point. And it's very interesting whether Trump would be able to pull that off, because there's no question. I mean, it's the housing costs um, in California just horrific, and the way everything kind of works in California, that the particularly private landowners, and how much they're able to extract from the state is it's just quite extraordinary. I mean, we talked about this at the time of the fires, and who controls the water, and how just a few private individuals have access to an extraordinary amount of water. You always assume, oh well, of course, water, that's a public good, and it belongs to the public. But apparently, in California, it isn't the case. And so, there's a few individuals who are able to control the water supply. So again, I mean, but it goes back to this issue of the land. But of course, again, if Trump tries to do this, he will generate huge opposition. But I'm absolutely all for it. There needs to be more housing built. I mean, there has to be some way in which California becomes at least halfway affordable as it once was. So anyway, thank you so much, Robert. Very good point. Um, Vic says, but do you support deporting people en masse to the Salvadorian gulag? I mean, this is a dystopian solution. No, I don't. I don't think that's the right way to go. I don't think there should be in that prison in El Salvador. I think that's um, that. I mean, I think that, particularly in the case of the Venezuelans, I don't see any reason why they can't be forced on Venezuela. Venezuela has to take them. then the Venezuelan government can decide what it wants to do with them. But absolutely, the Venezuelan government should take them. Now, in the case of Garcia, who is a citizen of El Salvador, that's rather different, because I think El Salvador should take him, and then it's up to El Salvador to decide what he wants to do with him. Now, if El Salvador believes that he's a gang member and whatever, then I guess they have to decide what to do. I mean, you know, uh, but no, you're right. For Trump people to go down that path, it weakened their case, because you could always just point to, hey, yeah, all right, deport them, but why into this place, and why should Venezuelans um, be dumped into this this prison in El Salvador? That makes no sense at all. So I think deportation is reasonable, particularly in the case of criminals. Um, but there has to be at least, if it's going to be in El Salvador, there has to be at least some connection to El Salvador. I mean, you can't just sort of dump people who have no in El Salvador who have no links at all to El Salvador. So anyway, thank you. Marty, always good to see you, Marty. Very, really, Tuesday, and always happy for Marty's generosity, as well as his very interesting and colorful postings. So thank you, Marty. Anne Marie, always good to see you, Anne Marie. Who's our musical expert, who has always has very interesting insights and fascinating observations and descriptions of pieces of music, and her experience of playing pieces of music, and her experience of interacting with distinguished conductors and composers. We're very fortunate to have it on our pages on local. So always look at that. I'd be curious, to read, Anne Marie, your comments on the Rimsky-Korsakov's Easter Overture that I posted on Sunday. So it may not be your thing. It's but I thought that it was appropriate, since it was Easter weekend, so we would have an Easter piece of music. So it was either that or Parsifal, but I figured that Parsifal might be just a little bit too long. It would be just maybe too much of a burden for Gagglers. So I kind of weighed up, what should I do, the Rimsky-Korsakov's Easter Overture, or should I do Parsifal? And then I thought, no, this is, I think it'll be too much. Even though, Parsifal is, I think, one of the greatest works in Western music. So we may still post Parsifal at some point. But Anne Marie, thank you very much. And then Dennis Greenshank says, yes, Vic, dystopian indeed. Did the U.S. not encourage young men to flee from Venezuela to the land of freedom because of their hatred of the progressive socialist government of Maduro? Well, I don't know that they actually encouraged them to flee, because if you encourage people to flee, then the next question is, well, flee where? Are you going to take them? And then the U.S. will say, well, we've already got enough illegals here. What do we want more people? So they certainly encouraged the overthrow of the Maduro government, and they certainly imposed sanctions and hardships to make life for Venezuelans as hard as possible. But they didn't actually say, "Hey, come on over here." You could say maybe it's a consequence of doing that, but these people are, they're not exactly um, refugees fleeing the economic hardships and hunger. I mean, these people have some serious criminal records. So either way, I mean, there's no, if you're in the country illegally, then you basically don't have a leg to stand on. You have to be removed. But I don't think a prison in El Salvador is the answer. There's no reason, no justice in doing that. NKMARD, thank you very much. Says it's Tuesday. It feels like Friday here. Anyways, things in general feel very accelerated nowadays. Well, I agree with you. It's like Tuesday, and it's already been a busy week. Um, uh, but that's because there's so much happened during Easter weekend. Normally, a very quiet time. It's supposedly a quiet time for meditation, but we had that bizarre Supreme Court ruling, and then of course we had the death of the Pope. So it's been quite busy. But in Trump time, it's always it's always busy. I mean, it's like I don't know what we're all going to do when Trump leaves. I think there's going to be serious withdrawal symptoms. I mean, luckily we've still got another almost 4 years of Trump. Getting high on Trump, but once he goes and he's replaced by somebody boring, and there's no prospect of Trump coming back, that's gonna be hard to get back to normal. Anyway, Robert says, Big Tish. Oh, I lost this. Yeah, where are we? Yeah, Robert says Big Tish is also accused of misrepresenting the number of units in a Brooklyn townhouse she owns. Yes, that's right. I think it's a 5 room townhouse, but she claims it's 4 rooms, um, and for the 4 units in the mortgage applications, because I think if it's the discrepancy is significant because properties with 4 or fewer units are typically eligible for residential mortgage rates, whereas 5 unit properties are classified as commercial and carry higher interest rate. Yeah, that's the reason. That's right. So she's done that in the case of Virginia, saying that was a way for her to get preferential mortgage in Virginia by claiming that's going to be her primary residence. But she did something similar in this townhouse in Brooklyn, claiming it has 4 units rather than 5 units, and because then it gets a residential mortgage rate rather than commercial property rate. So, yeah, she's a there. There is. It's not unusual for there to be karma. There's somebody who makes a ridiculous case, an absolutely ridiculous case of fraud against Trump. Lo and behold, that person is then caught in a real fraud, and not just one fraud, but in more than one fraud. It's kind of there's always something. It's like the instances of when plagiarism. It's like whenever somebody um, is caught plagiarizing, then the person who actually did catch the plagiarist is then often found to be a plagiarist himself. There's always that sense that if you're a plagiarist, you have a particular knack for identifying other plagiarists. So again, so if you're a fraudster, you have a knack of sniffing out fraud everywhere else. So yeah, that's. I mean, it'd be very very good. I mean, it would be very very nice if she gets a real comeuppance. Given this is the Trump Justice Department, I think it's going to be a little. She's in a tight spot. Um, now, it, I mean, I would imagine that even if the state court rather than a federal court goes after her, um, she's still going to be in a tight spot. Anyway, Judy, always good to see you. Judy Hotchkiss, thank you very much for your generosity. And Judy says, how do you deport people for their criminal backgrounds, proven or otherwise, to El Salvador and expect to maintain good relations with El Salvador? They would expect that you help them detain such people and allow them to sort such cases as they see fit. Besides, Trump made a big deal out of showing illegals how to self deport. Anyone worried about being sent to such a gulag should self deport right away. Well, Trump seems to have pretty good relations with Bukele. the current president of El Salvador, who for some reason has become a kind of a hero of the on the right, not just in the United States but elsewhere. I mean, in Europe as well. They kind of Bukele, next to um, they, so he's not quite in the Orban, the field category, but he's a he's a big fan. He has a huge fan base in there. Now, I imagine Bukele agreed to this because he's getting a lot of money in exchange. I mean, the Americans are providing him with a lot of money, so he's taking in all these prisoners. I mean, it's a uh, now. I guess if you're an ordinary person in El Salvador, you probably aren't very happy about their coming in on the other than if they're going to be in that prison forever. I mean, you basically you don't want your country to be a dumping ground for criminals unless you can guarantee that nobody's ever released, which obviously isn't much in the spirit of civil liberties. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's not. I don't think any country particularly wants to be a dumping ground for criminals. Like it's like country becomes a dumping ground for nuclear waste. Um, uh, but in terms of good relations, I mean, there's certainly good relations with Bukele. Um, that meeting in the Oval Office was an extremely convivial, in which they kind of joked and bantered around. Um, and I would imagine that the Americans are helping them to detain such people. I don't know that uh, big prison that has been built. Probably the Americans helped build it. Probably Americans are going to invest a lot more money in building and modernizing it and so on. Um, but uh, the I, it's a hard one. I mean, I don't quite see that this is an ideal solution. I mean, if you go if you're from El Salvador, fine. You can take them to El Salvador, and then what, and that's it. I mean, it seems odd way to justify people who have no connection to El Salvador taking them to a prison in El Salvador. I should say though that a lot of people talk about obviously, hey, this is inhumane. I mean, you're taking Venezuelans. They should be in Venezuela, not in El Salvador. I think it's a very reasonable argument. But if you look at these courts, like the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, or the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, or the International Criminal Court, nobody ever complains that defendants are hauled from their countries, whether it's Serbia or Bosnia and Herzegovina um, or Rwanda. They're taken to, to a prison in a different country. I mean, in the case of The Hague. And then after their trial and conviction, they are taken to serve their sentences, usually 30, 40 years. I mean, far longer sentences than the El Salvador. I mean, the people who were convicted by the ICTY, they didn't go and serve a 5-year sentence. This is 30, 40 years, life. Indeed, life sentences in the case of Karadzic and Mladic, the leaders of the Bosnian Serbs. They got life imprisonment. And then they are made to serve out their prison terms, not in their home countries, where they would be at least close to their families and their friends, so that their families could come and visit them. No, they were made to serve their prisons in the UK. or in Norway, or in Ireland, or something. So very, very far from from their homes. So in other words, they can never be visited by their friends and families. And incidentally, um, they in some cases they were put in prisons that they knew they would be in danger in. And so when you have somebody like, say, Radislav Kristic, a general who was convicted of complicity in genocide in Srebrenica, so Kristic was assigned to serve his prison term, which was 35 years. Nice generosity. So again, no one, these things, no one gave a damn about any of these people. 35 years, Karadzic, Mladic, life, others 40 years, and so on. Anyway, so Kristic was made to serve out his prison term in the UK, and sent to a prison where, what do you know, there are a lot of Muslims. And the Muslims would know who Kristic was, and they would say, "Hey, Kristic, hey, he's the guy who committed mass murder against Muslims." And of course, there was an attempt to murder Kristic. He barely survived this attempt. I mean, he was left unconscious. Somebody slit his throat, so he almost died. And then he was sent to, I think, to a prison, maybe in Sweden. I'm not sure. So, in all these cases, nobody gives a damn. I mean, suddenly we're all weeping about Venezuelans in El Salvador, and it's reasonable. I don't think they should be sent to this gulag in El Salvador, but I wish, that these weeping liberals had extended even, 1/100th of that sympathy for all the people who were sent to prisons all over the place, hundreds, thousands of miles from their homes, and therefore essentially isolated. And isolated, incidentally, even in a worse way than the Venezuelans in El Salvador, because at least the Venezuelans in El Salvador have a common language. They all speak Spanish. In the case of these Serbs, they were sent to these countries to serve out their prison terms, countries that they don't know the language. Go to Norway. I mean, they don't know any Norwegian. And so never any sympathy there. So, I think, before we start weeping, it'd be nice if there was at least a modicum of the same sympathy for others who are assigned to serve out their prison terms, miles and miles away from their family and friends. Anyway, Judy, as always, thank you so much for your generosity. And let's go on. Go back. Yeah. No. All right. Yeah. Okay. And then Robert says, in news from the Garden State, Nadine Menendez, that's your former senator's wife, has been convicted as complicit in Bob's bribery scandal. What a contrast to the case of Hunter Biden, where his former wife maintains she had no idea whatsoever of the origins of Hunter's ill-gotten gains. It's interesting, though. I wonder, will she do time? I wonder whether they might just tap her on the wrist and not force her to do time. I don't know. And then NKMRD, he was replying to Judy's comment, says, there is some brutal sort of globalist, sort of socialist, even some kind of anti-US and to some degree anti-Israel perspective and agenda regarding the USA, which is difficult to comprehend because it's not full anti-everything, anti-this, anti-that. It's embedded in the global networks that developed I think personally. However, some of this agenda is part of the U.S. owned DA. It's the DNA. It's not only some mysterious threat from the outside, but it might revive communism angst in some way for some people. Well, it's an interesting thing. The El Salvador case is is quite a remarkable one because I'm certainly old enough to remember the war in El Salvador in the 1980s, a very very nasty, brutal war that America was heavily involved in. We talked about that the other day. It involved the killings of nuns, priests, Archbishop Romero, um, and the you would think that would turn El Salvador very much against the Americans, um, and but somehow well that seems really very much in the past. I mean, the here you have a president who does have you know, you know, and who's very popular and who's very pro-American. And I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm not saying I like him or approve of him, but he does seem very popular, and he does seem pro-American. So everything that happened in the 1980s does seem to be ancient history. But he's an American creature. I mean, all this is he's getting paid. He's getting big bucks for housing all these deportees. Um, I mean, the question then is, well, what else do you do? I mean, you can certainly dump them in Guantanamo. I mean, that would be one solution. Um, and then that clearly that you could try to do that, but you can't. Because we're talking about so many. It's going to take a long time to be able to um, put them into get their home countries to accept them. I mean that it's quite a lot. It's going to be a long process. We're talking about a large number of migrants, and so I think this is more of a kind of a temporary holding place, at least just to begin to address the problem, because Trump needs to be seen to be doing something. I mean, he promised we're going to start the deportations right away. If you're going to go through the whole process where you got to get find the country that this person belongs to, then you got to get the country to agree to accept him, um, and then and then go. That's going to take forever. So I think Trump wants to accelerate the process, and so either it's going to be El Salvador or it's or Guantanamo. But otherwise, you're just going to be litigating this. I mean, it'll take forever, and nobody will ever get to leave. Um, but it's not a good. It's not desirable. But then it isn't really desirable to have 10 million or whatever migrants that came into the U.S. just in the past 4 years. I mean, that's a very drastic demographic change that a country has to address. Um, and it's hard to come up with a good, ready, easy solution. Anyway, Vic says, what are your most vivid memories of growing up and living your youth years in Britain? It would be the 70s, right? Isn't it considered a rather gloomy era of socioeconomic crisis in Britain's history? Try not to cry. I know this question may make you feel nostalgic. Also, could you elaborate on your favorite British music and or films from those years? Well, yes. I mean, yeah. My memories. I think I kind of remember the sort of the late '60s and then the early '70s. They, yes, they were kind of grim in some ways, but it didn't really affect me particularly because, I lived a quite nice life in London, and and it was pleasant. I was going to university. I went to University College London, and I was at the London School of Economics. Um, so that was all very pleasant. Um, so yeah, I kind of feel a certain nostalgia. That world has gone. The London of the 1970s um, just isn't there anymore. You go to London, it's just a completely different city. Um, and the I guess the politics of the time was a lot more interesting and intriguing than this horrific creatures who've been succeeding one another in Britain. Um, I think that would be, you know, my most vivid memories. Yeah, would be London in those days, very which was very pleasant. Um, Now the question of the films, I can't say that the films of the 1970s were, at least in the UK, I found particularly appealing. So the films that I did watch in those days were almost always the American films. I like the same American films of the 1970s that everybody else likes. All the Godfather, the French Connection, all those things that which. But one of the best films of the from the UK in the 1970s is one that we have featured on the Gaggle, which is The Long Good Friday. And now The Long Good Friday, which is, I think, a very good film, that gives you a nice glimpse into London of the 70s. Because yes, in some ways, some things were a little gloomy, but there was a lot of kind of optimism at the time. Things are going to get better. Things would be there'll be development and prosperity and so on. So that film kind of captures um, a moment in Britain. I mean, to be honest, the the grimmest parts of Britain came a little bit later. I think during the 1980s, when there was real um, shutting down of industries and huge unemployment. That came later. It wasn't quite in the 70s. The 70s, people still had jobs. The problems were more to do with unions and strikes, and they were depressing. But at least people had jobs. In the 1980s, people were losing their jobs, and then things got quite bleak. Um, and I can't say again British music on those years. No, I don't like. I mean, I like British music, but really from a different era. And we featured some of those at the Gaggle. The era of uh, Edward Elgar and Vaughan Williams, William Walton. That is a different era. That makes me nostalgic, even though I that was obviously before my time, but it gives me some image of an England that had been um, long before. It's like I have a nostalgia for a previous England, the one that I didn't actually um, experience. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but somehow, so when I listen to Elgar, I think oh yeah, that's the England that I love. But that's not an England that I ever experienced directly. It's the England I imagined, the England that I read about, but it was always before my time. Um, and anyway, Robert said, apropos, but anyway, thank you, Vic, for that question. And then Robert says, but the situation is apropos of Vic's question about the society of the spectacle. The situationists seem to follow in the footsteps of Thorstein Veblen, extending conspicuous consumption to the consumption of manufactured news, as well as virtue signaling, i.e., the conspicuous display of the proper progressivist perspective. Huh. Well, that's interesting. I like the sound of that. And then Vic says Trump already said to Bukele, tongue in cheek, that next he would like to deport U.S. homegrown criminals. Yeah, he did say that, and he said that now a few times, but I don't think that's going to happen. I really don't see it because there's no mechanism. You can't just deport. Um, you can't deport American citizens. Whatever crimes that they've committed, um, they're American citizens. Different for other countries. Serbs. Yeah, absolutely. You can grab a Serb and force him to serve his prison term in the UK. But no, you can't make an American citizen uh, serve his prison in El Salvador. And I don't know that there's any real. I mean, I guess maybe there's a shortage of prison space in the U.S., but that's not a insuperable problem. I mean, you can always build more prisons. I don't think that's a case that Trump would lose any attempt to deport an American citizen. It's never been done. So I don't think it can be. As you say, it's tongue in cheek. Trump knows how to own a news cycle. And as soon as he says that, everyone's going to be screaming, a CNN screaming, "Oh my God, he's planning to deport Americans." He's not going to do it. There's just no way you can do it. Judy says the big shift after the JFK assassination was in economic policy. JFK had continued usual policies of infrastructure and high tech innovation. His space program created Silicon Valley, but LBJ broke the gold reserve dollar with his Great Society and expensive Vietnam War, followed by Nixon being bum rushed into shutting down Bretton Woods. Then everything was globalized. My bet is on the City of London financial oligarchy rubbing out JFK. All right, well, you pays your money and you takes your choice. Obviously, I don't think that happened. But the question is, yes, of course, LBJ pursued that policy, but Kennedy was a fairly orthodox person when it came to economic policies. I mean, he really didn't do anything drastic. He had tax cuts, and he believed in balancing budgets. So he wasn't doing anything very drastic. Johnson did do something very drastic. I mean, he was trying to run the Vietnam War and these ridiculous Great Society programs, and was obviously, but driving inflation. And then, of course, he was essentially exporting inflation to other countries who really didn't like it, and then began exchanging their dollar reserves, which were losing value every day because of inflation. They kept exchanging it for gold, and of course, sooner or later, it was bound to end up with the America going off the gold standard because it was just basically running out of gold. John Connolly told Nixon, I mean, basically, we're just running out of gold. There's no more gold here. So that had to end, the convertibility of the dollar into gold. But it was Johnson, not Kennedy, who embarked on this drastic policy. And then Judy says, remember, it was the British MI6 that created the CIA during World War II. The Dulles brothers were huge Anglophiles. Well, John Foster Dulles was, he screwed over the British, right royally over Suez. I don't know whether anybody really thinks in Britain that John Foster Dulles was particularly an Anglophile. That was the biggest humiliation Britain ever suffered at the hands of the Americans. Neither before nor since have the Americans humiliated Britain in that way. And Dulles was kind of crafty. I mean, they set a trap for the British, It was very much Dulles who was setting the trap. Dulles went along with all these plans. He knew what the British were up to, but he let them go ahead with their invasion of Egypt, and then the trap was set, and the Americans uh, condemned the British and the French, and forced a run on the pound. So it was, John Foster Dulles. It was no friend of Britain. He set a trap um, for the British, because if the British had thought for one moment that the Americans were going to turn against them on Suez, and particularly if the Americans would go to the United Nations to condemn the British, and the Americans would trigger a run on the pound, the British would not have done this. They would not have done the Suez. So Dulles played a very devious hand there against the British, and essentially they did it in order to diminish Britain as an imperial power. I mean, essentially, they wanted the British out of the Middle East once and for all, and that was the reason why the Americans took the position they did over Suez. So that was John Foster Dulles, um, and um, and then okay. This says NKMRD says the problem is that these works are hard to translate because of the very specific language the author uses. I read the Polish translation, which was very good. I can't. Okay, I'll take a look. Um, um, okay, so there's a lot of talk here about the situationism. Vic, you're always very good at remembering names. Films, says Get Carter is a good UK 1970s film. Yeah, you're right. You're right. You put me on the spot there. I couldn't think of it. Yeah, but Get Carter was a pretty good film. And yeah, that was. I mean, quite violent. Um, but what the British managed to do in those kinds of films is they kind of made essentially kind of American style gangster movies, but in the British context. Um, yeah, that was really good. But I mean, there was another film made around that time was Man at the Top. It was based on John Brayne's novel, Room at the Top, which was made into a film. We did that on the Gaggle, Room at the Top, and then there was Life at the Top, and then they made a TV series of that, Man at the Top, and then they made a film of the TV series. So it was just one of, but the film itself was not bad. I mean, it caught some of the atmosphere of the time of Britain in the 1970s, and similar to the Long Good Friday, we suddenly and Get Carter as well. A lot of ambitious, uh, aggressive business people. It wasn't no longer a kind of hidebound, class-ridden society. Britain was where people go ahead people from a working class backgrounds, young, aggressive, ambitious working class lads could make a lot of money, by you know one crooked means or another, but there was a way that you could make a lot of money. And Get Carter featured that. Man at the Top featured that. So yeah, that was quite good. I mean, now that I think of it, there's some those films were pretty good. Um, uh, Robert says very salient point. He's a very salient. You can assassinate American citizens as Obama did. You just can't deport them. That's very good. That's very well put. Yes, you can't. You can't. Yes, you can't deport them. Um, I mean, it says like you can't even deport non-American citizens, but that's also. But you can assassinate American citizens, but don't deport them, and even don't deport non-American citizens. Um, and then where were um, all So then, and then yeah, and then anyway, just to finish the job, also about the Long Good Friday. If you haven't seen it, check out the 1982 BBC interview with Hoskins. Yeah, I think that Marty posted that on our page, so that should be there. So it's on our locals page for when we had the screening of the Long Good Friday. This interview, 1982 interview with Bob Hoskins. Um, yeah, so here's the link. Yeah, yeah, yeah. He was a very insightful guy. But that's interesting, Vic. I mean, you brought up Get Carter, which I'd forgotten about. Be interesting. I mean, if you could remember some more of those films from the 1970s, like Get Carter, like Man at the Top. It'd be kind of interesting because then we can have a screening of some of the British films of the 1970s. I think that's a good idea for a Monday night at the movies screening. Anyway, my time is up. Thank you everybody who have joined me. Thank you above all for the people who. And Perus, I just noticed it. What's your take on the movie version of The Day of the Jackal? Very good, very good. I reviewed it. We didn't have a screening of that, but I reviewed it, and it's a super film. Interestingly enough, I mean, I guess it's. I mean, I wouldn't say it was exactly an English film. I mean, the film director was from Austria, Fred Zinnemann. The actor, I mean, obviously, Edward Fox played the Jackal, but it's a really good film, really entertaining. But I reviewed it, so you can always go to the Gaggle locals page, and you can find my review of the Day of the Jackal. And yeah. Anyway, I'm getting a little distracted here. So thank you to everybody who joined me. Thank you above all for the great questions and comments, and especially to those who have contributed to the tip jar, and therefore, did something to put the dogs into a slightly better mood. Vic says I can check my collection. Yeah, please, because I'm really interested. I can't think of films at the top of my head, but there probably were some pretty decent films made in that moment of Get Carter and so on. Anyway, thank you. The dogs will thank you, and we will be back on Thursday at the same time. Until then, good night. Bye bye. See you soon. All the best.